Hi, welcome. Whether you're trying to live a long and healthy life or to try and be as successful and as productive as possible, health is a key component that underpins all of those things. So in this video, I want to discuss 6 of the most important and life-changing lessons that I've learned within the health space, and hopefully it helps you too. So just a quick disclaimer, I'm not a doctor myself, and nothing I talk about is intended to be or replace any medical advice that you've been given. But I do have a science background and a massive interest in health sciences, so hopefully you find this content useful. And again, not everything might be applicable to you, given that if you have some underlying health condition, but everything that I talk about will be backed by lots of heavy science research. So let's get into the video. So the first thing to mention is I've always considered health to be a trifecta of 3 things. 1 is sleep, 1 is diet, and 1 is exercise. And if you neglect any one of these things, it kind of destabilizes the entire thing. So you need all 3 of those to be maximally healthy, but you can sort of offset one slightly if the other 2 are in really good shape. And everything I cover here is going to cross into one or several of those 3 areas. So point number 1 is the difference between fat and fats. So there's a common misconception that when you eat food that contains fat, it will end up causing you to put on weight, but this is actually untrue. In fact, to some extent, it's the opposite. So research seems to show that those who go on a high fat diet as opposed to a high carb diet tends to do a lot better in terms of weight loss, but also weight maintenance. One of the reasons for this is that fat is a much more sustainable and slower release of energy. So if you have intaken foods that have high amounts of fat, especially again if they are the healthier fats, this fat releases its energy in a much slower and more gradual and sustainable level, so that when you eat food earlier on in the day, it can last and you don't get hungry until later in the day. So that's one of the reasons why you tend not to put on as much weight, because you don't get as hungry. But the other reason is because the energy that's released is a lot more stable. So rather than having a high carb diet and then you end up going through typically the instant energy and then the quick release, and that quick release feels great in the short term, but usually within a short amount of time it turns to a crash. And that's why if you have high carb, sugary or bready type foods, within an hour or 2 of eating them, you tend to go through a massive sugar crash. And this often kind of occurs around lunchtime, and that's why you end up getting the afternoon crash at work, where you're slightly falling asleep at your desk or you feel the need to go for a nap. And I find personally that if you replace these high carb lunches or brunches or whatever it may be with one that contains protein and fats, you find that your energy levels remain a lot more consistent, and as a result you would get much more out of the day in terms of productivity. So a good example is actually the ketogenic diet, which is actually built on the principle of having high fat, high protein and low carb diets over a sustained period. So what ends up happening is you end up putting your body into a state of ketosis, which is shown to reduce inflammation and reduce disease and overall come with a whole range of health benefits. The only thing about the ketogenic diet is it is quite difficult to sustain over a period of time. So it can work wonders in the short term, and if you do have the discipline and the intent and the motivation to try the ketogenic diet and keep it going, you will generally feel better and also lose weight. But again, it's one of those things that your body will fight to try and get a little bit more balance in the diet. But I still think the principle of having high fats as a replacement for high carbs is definitely one to keep in mind. So point number 2 is sleep on it. And what I mean by this is people just assume that sleep is quite a passive process, that when you go to sleep and then you wake up, you feel a little bit more energetic and well rested. But in reality, sleep is a very active process. So when you go to sleep, particularly in the deeper stages of sleep, your body goes into quite an active state. And one of those is REM, or rapid eye movement. And it's quite active because if you could see what your eyes are doing when you're in this stage of sleep, it is called REM because your eyes flicker very quickly up and down or side to side. And during this process, your body is doing several things, one of which is to consolidate memories. So it's basically grabbing short-term memories and pulling them into long-term storage. So that's why, if you have an exam or you have something important coming up, whether it's the next day or in the next few days, getting good night's sleep in the short term, but also more importantly, consistently over that time, will help you better retain that information when you need it. The other thing is there's a big detoxifying process going on, so that when you're sleeping, your brain over the course of the day builds up metabolic waste because your brain is consuming a huge proportion of your energy and calories throughout the day. So this builds up waste, similar to like a sewage system over the course of a day. So you need to clear that waste, and this waste typically gets cleared during sleep, and particularly the deeper stages of sleep. That's why if you don't sleep particularly well, or you've been drinking alcohol and you're hungover, you tend not to reach those deeper stages of sleep as well. And it's one of those components that contributes towards that feeling of nausea or just not feeling great after a night out as well. The other interesting fact about sleep that people don't seem to know, including myself, I only came across this information relatively recently, and that's the idea that we all have a chronotype. And a chronotype is that thing that makes you feel like you're either a morning person or an evening person, or you have a tendency to prefer to get up early, or you've that kind of proclivity towards going to bed later and getting up later. This is something that I've always assumed was actually habit, and it's just something that, due to your own structure or lack of, you end up kind of gravitating towards a certain lifestyle, maybe going to bed late or going out late and then getting up late. But actually, it's shown to be genetically influenced. So going back thousands of years, we've kind of evolved from small tribes or groups of people living in and around caves. And these were quite uncertain times and quite dangerous times, so that if you weren't careful, you could be invaded either by a neighboring tribe or group of dangerous animals. So typically how we combat this is to have people on watch. And one of the most efficient ways of dealing with these dangerous conditions was to have the smallest possible window where everyone was sleeping. And what genetically has happened in terms of evolution is that we all have a chronotype. And this makes it so that certain people are happy to kind of get up early and go to bed early. Another group of people are somewhere in between. And the last group of people tends to prefer to get up late and go to bed late. And that way, it's roughly a third per group. And this is spread across the entire kind of human race. And everyone has a chronotype. And because of this kind of tendency or breakdown, we end up minimizing the amount of time that we are all sleeping at the same time. And that has allowed us to survive in those conditions, because there'll be a very small window where we could be invaded while everyone is sleeping. Point number 3 is don't bet on the carb. Society as a whole has become heavily reliant on carbs for fuel. And this goes back to a previous point where I said that fats are a better source of energy, but at the same time, we still need carbs to survive. And the most basic form of carb is like a simple sugar, it's glucose. So a general rule of thumb is that the simpler the carb, i.e. how closely related it is to glucose and how easy it is to break down into glucose, the shorter spike the energy releases. So if you have something like table sugar or something with lots of sugar in it, you tend to get a spike of energy very quickly, but then a very quick downward spike. And this is great when you need a sudden energy boost, but it's not great when you need your energy to survive throughout the entire day or a large portion of the day. But it's important to keep in mind that we are pre-programmed to respond to these types of carbs, because again, going back to those kind of paleontological times, carbs, especially those sweet foods, were few and far between. They grew as fruit or berries, and these things were something that were typically seasonal, but also quite rare. So when you found them, you want to consume them immediately because you don't know how long they're going to be there. They may, only be around for that particular season, and they may go off or become stale within a short amount of time. So we're pre-programmed to respond to these types of carbs and not resist them. But unfortunately, in modern times, we have these types of carbs in abundance, and there's so many sugary foods available and around us, so that we end up being tempted to eat those types of things. And the thing about carbs is, while it's a great form of short-term energy, it's also a great way to put on weight, which is what most people are trying to avoid. So if you are going to have carbs, the types of carbs that you should try to prefer are the more complex ones, such as starchy foods, or even better, fiber. There's a reason why in Hollywood, when actors are trying to train for a particular role and become as strong and as fit as possible, they tend to go through a very strict diet of chicken and broccoli and rice. And that's because the rice is a form of carb, but it tends to be one that's more complicated, that's more starch based, as opposed to a type of carb like sugar, which again gives you that short-term burst of energy but is short-lived. So the next point is sustainable fitness or sustainable exercise. And what I mean by this is fitness is great in that it makes you feel good and it kind of makes you healthier, but the type of fitness you choose will have a huge influence in how long you're able to maintain that routine or ritual over a period of time. So for example, if you go down the kind of mainstream route of I need to go to the gym equals fitness, and you absolutely despise the gym, maybe it's very boring to you, maybe it's really tedious, maybe it's just very uncomfortable and it's not something you get any enjoyment out of whatsoever, you may be able to motivate yourself in the short term to go to the gym. But if it's not something that you inherently get enjoyment from, or at least some kind of satisfaction, then it's going to be something that you will struggle and wrestle with going forward. And there's going to be days where you're not feeling particularly motivated. And because of how much of a chore it is to go to the gym, you'll end up finding an excuse as to why you shouldn't go. And that's not the point of fitness or exercise. It should be something that you get the benefits of doing the fitness or exercise activity, but while doing something that you actually enjoy in the first place. So I'm actually planning on making a video on 3 alternatives for the gym. So if your goal is to get fit or get healthier and the gym just isn't for you, then these will be 3 activities that you can use as a replacement for the gym, but still get a lot of the same benefits. So the next one is the rise of AI. And I chose this title specifically because I have an interest in AI, but in this case, I'm not referring to artificial intelligence, but artificial ingredients. So a good example of artificial ingredients are artificial sweeteners, such as sucralose or aspartame. And these are found in lots of foods as a replacement for sugar counterparts. So one example would be kind of fizzy drinks or sodas. There's been a rise in popularity moving from, say, something like normal Coke or normal kind of fizzy orange towards something that has 0 sugar. And obviously on paper this sounds great. I get all the benefits that come with enjoying a nice kind of soda, but without the carbs or without the sugar that comes with it. So I think this sounds great. And when artificial sweeteners were first invented, they were kind of hailed as like this miracle. As time has gone on, it's become more and more apparent that these artificial ingredients aren't what people initially thought they were. In fact, a lot of the research that led to them discovering things like artificial sweeteners came from completely unrelated research, such as pesticide research. And this should tell you something about the side effects of artificial ingredients, or artificial sweeteners in this case, in that they were designed initially to kill small organisms, but we're using them as a substitute for sugar, which, while it's not healthy for you, especially in large doses, it's still naturally occurring. So there isn't a great deal of research in terms of the direct comparison between sugar foods and their sugar-free counterparts in terms of which is objectively healthier. And I think there's a reason why this is, and that's because there isn't anything to be gained by companies sponsoring research projects which show which one is better. But some of the research that has come out has shown some of the unwanted negative health effects that artificial ingredients have on your body. And one of them is it seems to influence your metabolism. So this is an interesting one specifically because people often gravitate towards sugar-free products in the attempt to lower their calorie intake. And really what this means is they're trying to lower the amount of fat that they put on, but actually it has a counterproductive effect because in lowering your metabolism, you end up putting on more weight, even though the amount of calories that you intake is less. This is likely due to the fact that these ingredients mess up your microbiome, which is a huge kind of influencer in terms of how effective your metabolism is. But another thing that artificial sweeteners have shown is that when you take them, you're kind of tricking your brain into thinking that while I'm having something that tastes sweet, I'm not getting any of the actual sweetness that comes with the food. And your brain then tries to overcompensate by making you crave something sweet because it expects sweetness, but you're not getting it. In turn, you end up craving something that gives you that sweetness, which is why people who have artificial sweeteners a lot tends to actually put on more weight, because not just of the microbiome, but because they have cravings that need to be fulfilled, and often is the case that they gravitate towards sweet foods and then not realize that it's partly influenced by those artificial ingredients. At least that's what the research seems to imply. And the final point is the power of a good routine. And this could be going to bed at the same time every night, or it could be getting up at the same time in the morning, or doing things in a predictable way. Now, obviously, there's only so far you can take this, and there's only so far you should try to take this. Some people are naturally more kind of structured in terms of how they like to live, and other people are a lot more flexible. Typically, I kind of view it as some people operate much better when they know what's ahead of them, whereas other people tend to be more improvisational, which is totally fair. But having certain elements of your life as part of a routine definitely helps. And one of them is in the morning to try and get at least 10 or 15 minutes of daylight. And this might seem like a difficult task in the sense that you're working, or by the time you get up, or there's so many things to do, to just get exposure to direct sunlight on your skin is surprisingly difficult. But by doing this, it regulates so many things in terms of your circadian rhythm or body clock. It sort of primes it in that when you get that sunlight on your skin, it kind of sets your alarm for the entire day. It tells your body when you should start to get sleepy, when you should try to be alert. And typically we release, when we get that sunlight in the morning, we release cortisol, which is a chemical typically with negative connotations, but actually a normal amount of cortisol is a very good thing. It's what gives you that kind of get up and go, that urgency. But you don't want too much of that cortisol later on in the evening, because that will keep you up. So there's other hormones or chemicals that also get kind of regulated and primed and put in position based on your exposure to daylight. And when you get to the evening, because you've had daylight earlier on, your body knows that, okay, this is when I start the day. And when the daylight goes away and you put away things like devices before going to bed, your body puts you into a state where it expects you to sleep. And so it will kind of release all the right chemicals and hormones to make you feel sleepy. And then you end up having the best possible night's sleep, which sets you up for success the next day. And the pattern continues. So just by making small adjustments in terms of your routine, it kind of facilitates the routine for the forthcoming day, but even the next one after that. And it just compounds over time. And suddenly you're squeezing hours and hours more per week in terms of what you're trying to get done and what you're able to get done. So this is definitely something that I've been trying to do more myself, because I've got that personality type that tends to prefer kind of going with the flow and going how I feel at the time. But by adding a little bit more structure, I found that I'm able to get a lot more done and just feel a lot better as well. So that's definitely highly recommended. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down below. Equally, if there's any kind of constructive advice that you have or something that you think I'm missing, I'd definitely be interested in hearing about that. But for this video, that's all, and I look forward to the next one, and I'll see you there.